Welcome to our presentation. We are here today to present our pension valuation results for the XYZ pension scheme at the 5th of April 2010. The purpose of this valuation was to assess the financial position of the scheme and determine the funding level required by comparing the scheme's assets to its liabilities. This will help to identify the necessary steps to be taken should the scheme be in deficit or surplus. The valuation includes only the defined benefit section of the scheme at the valuation date and excludes the assets relating to the defined contribution of the scheme for both the assets and liabilities. The valuation is compliant with all professional requirements and is solely for your use as trustees of the XYZ pension scheme. However, we assess the financial position at the valuation date, which subsequently may have changed over time. In order to complete the pension valuation, we had to make a number of assumptions, both financial and demographic. When considering these assumptions, we used historical data as a basis to try and predict the likely figures and future figures. It is important that our assumptions can give a realistic view of actual figures. However, perfect accuracy is unlikely, as we do not have the advantage of hindsight, and therefore there may be a small discrepancy between our valuation and the actual future value. The inflation assumption we used was derived from the annualised RPI over a period of 20 years, which can be seen here. We assumed the figure of 3.5%, as this represented a similar figure to the average. Due to the volatile nature of RPI, which at the valuation date was expected to reach 5%, it is necessary to consider historical data over a number of years. Salary growth was assumed to be in line with RPI, also at 3.5%. Each member of the scheme was split into one of 5 categories, with the only change in the basis between all of the categories being the members' pension increases. This can be seen in the table here. We used a pre-retirement discount rate of 7%, which is 3.5% above our inflation assumption. This is appropriate as investment of the scheme's assets for benefits, which are not paid out until the future, will offer high but volatile returns, and so we have added a prudent risk premium, which we feel will compensate for this. Our post-retirement of 6%, which is 2.5% above our inflation assumption, is appropriate as investment of the scheme's assets for benefits, which are now in payment, will offer lower but more constant returns, and so a lower risk premium is more conservative and reflective of the investment returns. For our demographic assumptions, we used the PMI 92 base actuarial tables for males and females, pre- and post-retirement and non-pensioners, which are rated -3 to reflect improvement in mortality since 1992. When considering family, we assumed that a man is 3 years older than his wife and that 70% of males and 80% of females are married at retirement or their earlier death. Finally, we assumed that normal retirement age to be 65.
At the valuation date, which is the 5th of April 2010, our scheme had a total of 968 members. 344 of these are classified as being active members, and these are individuals still working for the company. 371 are deferred members, and these are individuals who left the service of the company some time ago and will have accrued a deferred pension at the date of leaving the company. The remaining 253 are pensioners, and these members have already retired and are receiving a pension. Each member of the scheme, whether they're active, deferred, or pensioners, is assigned a category, and this category refers to the pension increases assigned to them. The graph illustrates the proportions of active, deferred members and pensioners in each of the 5 categories using our valuation. In order to evaluate the level of asset funding relative to the value of the pension scheme, we have calculated the liabilities for active, deferred and pensioners using SuperVal software. The graph below shows the value of our liabilities and assets at the valuation date, and as shown in the PowerPoint, the breakdown of liabilities for active, deferred members and pensioners, and the value of the scheme's assets relative to total liabilities is also shown. The total liabilities for the active members of the scheme is equal to 39,525,531. For the deferred members, their total liabilities equal 7,780,228, whilst the liabilities for the pensioners equal 47,632,906. Therefore, the total liabilities equal £94,938,725, and with the scheme's assets being equal to £75 million, this leads to an overall deficit of £19,938,725. As a result, the level of asset funding relative to the liabilities of the scheme is equal to 79% as at the 5th of April 2010.
was 100% invested in equities, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. Equities historically provide higher returns over bonds, and so this was the reasoning behind such a concentrated investment. However, these higher returns are very volatile and subject to a lot of variation, with the higher returns compensating for riskier returns. This investment choice leaves the scheme very vulnerable to change in the equities market, and a fall in the value of equities could lead the scheme to be unable to meet its obligations, especially with regards to pensions and payment. Diversification of investment will help to stabilise the scheme's funding levels and prevent it from being totally dependent on the performance of the equities market. We recommend an investment split which would decrease the scheme's exposure to the riskier equities market and reduce the effects of small changes in the equities market on the scheme's funding level. We recommend that 15 million should be invested in overseas equities, 22.5 million invested in UK equities, 22.5 in fixed interest gilts, and 15 in index-linked corporate bonds. This totals to the original 75 million. By adopting this allocation split, we believe that the scheme will stabilise its funding levels over time and will have more consistent returns to be able to realistically meet provisions for benefits to meet now and in the future. In order to assess the scheme's vulnerability to changes in the assumptions on which we have based this valuation, we have approximated the impact of one-step changes on the scheme's funding level by altering these assumptions in isolations. It should be noticed that these alterations are not a worst-case scenario, and it is likely that due to the nature of the assumptions, the changes could occur in combination. We are simply taking an approximation of the scheme's susceptibility to changes in each one. So the first one we looked at was increased normal retirement age. The normal retirement age for the scheme, as at the 5th of April 2010, was 65. However, we have looked at the effects of increasing this age to 70 for all scheme members and how it impacts on the scheme's liabilities. The effects of this change are limited only to the active members of the scheme and would reduce this active liability by over 10 million. Next, we looked at the interest rate. Due to the volatile nature of this assumption, which at the 5th of April 2010 was 7%, we thought it would be important to look at the effect of a 1% increase and decrease in the change in the interest rate. The graph below on the PowerPoint highlights the differences in the scheme's liabilities at each of these three interest rates. We can see that the scheme's liabilities decreased when we increased the interest rate. We identified an increase of 14% and we reduced the interest rate from 7% to 6%. In contrast, we saw a fall in the liabilities of 19% when we increased our assumption to 8%. The purpose of this sensitivity analysis and the reasoning behind looking at these changes in the assumptions in isolation is to identify which assumptions the scheme's liabilities and funding levels are most susceptible to. Once we identify these, it is possible to closely monitor these assumptions and form contingency plans in order to put in place steps to be taken to limit the scheme's exposure to these changes. The effects of the scheme's funding level can be seen on the graph. And we see that with the increase of the normal retirement age to 70, this funding level has improved to 88%. With an increase, with a 1% increase in the interest rate, the funding level has fallen dramatically to 46%. The scheme's vulnerability to changes in the interest rate means that the company can now be aware of the need to focus on potential future changes to the interest rate, which could impact significantly on the scheme. Due to the large deficit at the 5th of April 2010, with the scheme only being 76% funded, we have examined possible steps that could be taken to reduce the liability through a change in our assumptions. The first thing we looked at was a change from RPI to CPI, which recent government announcements have proposed changing, because CPI is typically lower and will potentially cause a significant reduction in the scheme's future liabilities, with historical evidence showing that only 3 times in the past 20 years has CPI been greater than RPI. For the purpose of this analysis, we have assumed a CPI to be 0% 0.5% below RPI assumption of 3.5%. The graph highlights the significance of this proposed change and what impact it would have on our scheme's funding level, which would lead to a reduction of £7.071 million in our scheme's liabilities and would see an improved funding level of 83%. This would lead to a sustained reduction in the scheme's liability, as CPI is not expected to grow as quickly as RPI in the future. As although factors affecting RPI typically tend to also affect CPI, CPI is historically a slow-growing index compared to that of RPI. Next, we look at a change in the accrual rate. The scheme at the 5th of April 2010, the scheme's accrual rate was 60ths for the defined benefit obligations. However, this could be reduced to a rate of 80ths, and we would see a significant decrease in the active liability. The graph below compares the two accrual rates and highlights a 25% reduction in the active liability and the total cost savings of £9.881 million. Finally, we moved on to a change for the scheme from a final pensionable salary scheme to a career average revaluation scheme. We've looked up the impact of switching to a care scheme, which would take the average of a person's salary over each year of service. This impact would apply to the actives in isolation and would reduce their liabilities overall by £1.384 million, which would be a reduction of 1.21%, which you can see illustrated in the graph below.